My name is Steve. I'm going to speak a little bit of the work that I do in the classroom and just kind of, I think with you. Thank you. Yeah. As in real time as possible about some of the concerns. So I would call this absolutely a presentation and not a paper, because those are very different genres of action, I would say. Delay, liveness,
responsibility,
forms of preparation, just going to start. I'm going to read until it feels like I should stop. I'm just going to read a small text while this was playing. So this is a small text called tables and chairs. Tables and chairs. There. Look, here's a community of people who walk into rooms and wonder how on earth you're supposed to use the chairs in there. That's a strange scenario, a user says to himself. A community says to himself. They try on a table, they try on a chair. It is a workspace. It's a trial. It's a trial. The community of people who walk into a room are going to try and make group work space work for themselves. The first thing we do is to assess all tools and resources. We can never begin anything before we assess tools and the resources that we all have alone and together at our disposal. Furthermore, how are we to move in here? How free are we to change things around in here? The science intones that the freedom allotted to make a group workspace work is proportional to the relative number of rolling to non-rolling to fixed furniture. Within the typology of, for example, non-rolling furniture, there's a hierarchy from highest to lowest. It begins with one not broken and self-affixed furniture, followed by two not broken and not self-affixed furniture, to three broken and either self-affixed furniture. An example of number two, for example, is not broken and not self-affixed, and it's two sawhorses and a thick sheet of laminate plywood around the size of a residential door. It acts as a table. Though the table, if you ask the table, might want to have been something else. It's almost as if the table or ledge or some other furniture, either rolling or non-rolling, might decide to say, I do not agree with your assignment. I do not agree with your assessment of me. I would like to not be a chair, so to speak, but I would like to have a seat at the table in order to speak, so to speak. But everyone agrees, and the science is bound to corroborate that the organization up and down, left and right, it is rolling, movable furniture, that's the way to go. See, this guy. Rolling, movable furniture, it's the way to go. The furniture should be movable for sure, but it should just be a little bit rolling. Still with me? Should I keep going? It is the middle of the road between completely rolling and completely fixed furniture. It is ideal, especially for administrators of the group workspace, because it does not privilege ultimate freedom. That is rolling, ensuring that neither chairs nor its inhabitants have the capacity to suddenly roll it away. Nor does it have, on the other hand, paint oneself into a corner, so to speak, by securing objects directly to the architectural supports, thereby ensuring flexibility for a changing situation. It's best for tables and chairs to be movable, luggable, perhaps with 2 or 4 hands, but not rollable. Not rollable. Not affixed either, as too much mobility and no mobility whatsoever are both completely undesirable poles of an undesirable spectrum for the humble, overtaxed administrator charged to make the workspace work. I'll stop there for a second and I'll go into another thing. Does it want to go to the next slide? I teach design studios. I was trained as an architect, and now I teach in a program called multidisciplinary design at the University of Utah. I was born and raised in Englehart, Ontario, which everybody's been up the Highway 11. It is about 7 hours drive from this spot. Yeah. So I spent the first 19 years of my life in Englehart, Ontario. Population 1,000. High school graduating class 25. I graduated from the University of Waterloo. That feels important. It feels important to be in Toronto with you today and from Salt Lake City, because there's a sort of magnetic point. I've never been in Mississauga before. I didn't know anybody who ever went to Mississauga before. But if you go 25 minutes that way, I have most of my undergraduate friends who grew up to become architects, and my brother. And if I go the other way, I have the teachers who trained me at the University of Waterloo. One of whom, Andrew Levitt, who passed away last year, quite tragically, spoke very eloquently about the radical possibility of the studio. In one of his last public speeches, public engagements, he was in the middle of COVID, and he spoke extremely movingly about the need to mourn, to grieve studio as a space when it's taken away. That for people in this extended discipline, that space might be somewhere in the middle between these three things. It's not any one of those specifically, but it's all of those in tandem, in some sort of allyship, in some sort of dance. And studio exists between. I'm attending to three things. Yeah, I'm attending to credit and debt, as the university or state of higher education demands. Whose credit and whose debt is a really touchy subject, and the studio lives there. The studio also lives in an architectural inhabiting. Yeah, the body of the artifice of the building, the space that is given to a student, sometimes enough and often not enough, but we're forced as a cohort, as a group, to use that space together with furniture. Sometimes use spaces that are not typically assigned the studio, thanks to the crediting or debting institution, to make work. And the third place that studio might be at least situated is attending to the cohort. I teach in a program where the cohort is very small. It's a great privilege. 30 people per semester, per cohort, 16 students, studios, and that's a rarefied and almost obsolete privilege. But how do you attend to cohorts when they're different sizes? How do you attend to their needs as a collective body, as a corporeal body against the corporate body of the crediting or debting institution? So my work is about studio, even though the work that I'll show briefly today lives adjacent to studio. So maybe I'm thinking through maybe 4 different ways one might move. You start obviously with attendance of studio. You go there, you've paid tuition, you arrive, you're supposed to be there. And maybe if you're lucky, a student or a professor for that matter will participate in studio. So that might be the next, you might come up and you might go to participation. And I think I'm trying to think with this bottom right-hand corner a little bit more. How do you move from participation in, simply participation in, to having agency over that space, that studio, that triumvirate kind of construction, and finally performing with. I'm kind of advocating here, and I've tried to advocate for myself and then through students for studio and design to be kind of performance-centered practice. You could change the lineage of architectural history and say that it starts with performance and scales up and bodies up and solidifies and builds tools. So I like to think of it as a foundational form of architectural practice. It's just, you know, designing bodies in the classroom. So this is kind of laboratory space. I'm going to touch upon two. I know I've come past 2 o'clock here. I'm coming to like, I'm off screen now, yeah?
You're off screen.
Good. I'll speak from here. I'm going to talk about two activities. I call them plays, which I work together with students to do. Kind of hard to know what you call them. It's not theater per se, not a theater program. It's not even performance exactly, because performance can be sometimes a very dodgy semantic concept. So I tend to call them plays. On the first day of school, in a seminar, I'll say, we're going to make a play. I don't know what that play looks like, but whatever the content of that term, whatever the content of that class, it's going to be mediated by what I call a play. And they're like, well, what's a play? What's a play? What does that mean? We're making a play. Do we need scripts? Do we need a stage? Do we need costumes? No, probably none of those. So, but what we start to do is build through the class's content. Say it's a history theory class. We'll read things and we'll devise responses to those readings. And those responses and those readings will then become scripts, perhaps. Little things that they can memorize and put into their bodies, mess up, and then perform later on. You add up enough classes, you add up enough episodes of exercises, of field work. This is a class just trudging through buffalo snow, which comprised a kind of exercise for students. You build up enough of these episodes, enough of these mnemonic devices, I guess. You start to inhabit a university, the campus, as a set of interconnected spaces that each have their own memory. That starts to form a set of episodes that then we perform, so to speak, on the last day of class as a so-called play. We invite the public, in some cases food arrives, and we go forward. So this one's called A Play That Is a Tour in Buffalo. I want to speak how am I for time?
Maybe 10 more minutes.
Nice. So I'll move on. So this is a little sound bite that should come up for you. Yelena Gluzman, who's at the University of Alberta, who's an old friend. We've worked together on theater practice, and she's speaking as a sort of external critic for this work. She's based out of the University of Alberta now, a sort of hybrid between cognitive science and performance studies figure. And I'm just what you're going to hear is her speaking thinking in response to seeing the play, seeing this image and other images like this, videos of the play that were conducted, and how that might start to dislodge or disfigure what we typically think of A as a performance, A as a play, and B as the campus, and how we may study there, how we may find sites of study in that space. So it's kind of a little bit starts very abruptly, so just get ready.
Well, I think, to address that point, not like I was there, so not to speak for you guys at all, but something that you said really struck me, and you just kind of reiterated it, which is this thing of, well, what felt good and what felt like it might be interesting. It was interesting for us, and it's going to be interesting for someone else. So you're using this, in fact, a very you're not appealing to, let's say, a conceptual scheme or a story that you want to tell, but you're appealing to the sense of responsiveness. This is something that I responded to, so yeah, let's do this, because like, our friends are gonna come, we want to board, we want to respond to something, right? And so the litmus test for making a choice becomes, your own kind of pleasure and interest, right? Or somebody's number, maybe not everybody agrees necessarily, but like, seems like, oh, that, and you're like, oh, okay, well, we do this, or maybe you guys are at some point. And to me, that's very interesting, and that seems very, then scaling up to concept from that. That seems to be very related to the initial choice to, when you're leaving campus, to not look at the buildings and the pathways and the kind of things that you normally look at in architecture, but to think of the architecture of campus as something that's inscribed in your experience, in your emotional experience, in your responsiveness, in what you learn to attend to, and to make judgments. So that, I think, is a very interesting move, and that makes sense to me personally, with the choice to use performance golf, which is like so ephemeral, weird, and well, seemingly pointless, you know, and often like somewhat embarrassing, but feelings are embarrassing.
The idea of scaling up to concept, as opposed to starting from concept and whittling our way down, I think is a key element of risk in this work. And I don't want to necessarily aggrandize or lionize risk as always necessary, but I want to speak maybe for a minute about the risk students take to take studio in the first place. The special ecology of thought and self-initiation and ambition and trust that has to be attended to. Feelings are embarrassing. To see a design student, maybe who's never spoken, but will absolutely speak in front of their work. To see them speak in a way that is unconventional, not just for them, but for us, I think strengthens the sense of camaraderie, the will to camaraderie in the studio space. The relations that build between a cohort that have absolutely nothing to do with the execution of a project, that they themselves are a kind of project. I saw somebody who I've known since I was 19 last night, and then a couple minutes later, a guy rang on the doorbell, and it was another person I'd known since I was 19. And then a third person that I've known since I was 19 showed up at a house. So when I say feelings are embarrassing, I'm embarrassed to be feeling with you a little bit in Toronto what it might mean to build a cohort and how studio engenders that. That 20 years, 25 years later, I'm meeting the person I met in studio when I was 19, and we went through something. And we just went through projects. We built houses, like we designed houses. That's what you're supposed to do. So I'm trying, I guess what I'm trying to advocate for in this space a little bit is that performance practice, or a throwing outside of the sensical in the studio space can build other forms of relation. Beyond accreditation, beyond the worry of employment, and a kind of delay, a potential for delay, a suspension of disbelief in that space to move forward. Last fall, in a history theory seminar, I was lucky to receive a small grant to promote sustainability practice at the University of Utah. perhaps you have universities who are also promoting sustainability practice. It turns out that sustainability is a very open subject, as was discussed. So I proposed to make a play with my students in a history theory seminar, and we called it "This is Sustainability," which is very useful tip. I learned that if you just call the play that you're going to make "This is Sustainability," you can maybe start to trouble what is asked by the institution and triangulate it with your interest. And drawing students into everything, I think, is a sustainable practice. Anyway, so I'm going to run this video for a few minutes and just continue to think with you. This is, I'll tell you a little bit about the background. This is sustainability, again, was started on the first day of class when I suggested that we, foregoing other forms of deliverables, that we produce a play together. We make a play together. We invite our friends and family, and the look on faces is really important to me. The look that how a student may respond positively or negatively in the moment of something silly, even, is really important to me. To see the amusement in eyes, I think, is a really key aspect, because you want them to gossip about you after you leave. You want the gossip to be good. You want it to be productive. You want it to be about the work. And maybe the best question about work is, why are we doing this? Not why are we doing this? Oh, because if the trust building is accomplished, then the why are you doing this becomes a productive space for those things to happen. I'm sorry to have not prepared a text for you today, because I would like at least to model slightly what I'm asking my students to do, is to have a couple ideas in their head and then take up space with their bodies, and assume that risk. Assume that the risk of illegibility will have to be dealt with collectively. Assume that the work that's being done, aka a play, is not exactly designed, and that has to be wrestled with. But to wrestle with that in real time and to build, I think, the muscles of improvisation in the design student is paramount. That we could stand up in front of somebody, assume a pregnant pause, connect eyes, and make some small differences. What is actually happening here is we gathered from the university about 50 discarded pallets as props for this piece. What you're seeing them do at this moment is put them into arrangements that we discussed in class, that we sort of obtained a consensus on, and distribute it, and then repiled and redistributed. I do not want to presuppose concept or meaning necessarily on that act, but I do want to advocate for the fact that it was done collectively, and that if you start to see their faces, and if you want to just, like, as you're watching, just look at their eyes doing things, it's a kind of look that I never saw when I was teaching when I teach kind of standard studio. It's a different look. I'm not saying it's a better look. I'm not saying you don't need both looks and both body, but as a designer, as designers, I think people are able to absorb multiple looks and assume multiple modes. So again, we're mostly moving palettes around. We're stepping on them at some point. It moves through various acts where they give speeches, small speeches. They interact with audience. There's a group that made food. There's a group that wanted to silk screen merchandise. And so while this is going on in the background, there's a silk screen station of merchandise that you can bring in a t-shirt. and then we'll put a that's the sustainability print onto. So working in the, trying to model in this space, like that my notes, this is as many notes as would have existed in play. There's no script, there's embodied knowledge, embodied things that they do on repetition. Are we for time now?
Out of time.
What?
Oh yeah, we're out of time. Just for now, we have to ask you to pause. How's that?
Absolutely. That's a great way to end. Thank you. Yeah.
Thank you. All right, lots to think about. Thank you so much. Ask Martin Schwartz to come up and or sit down, or wherever it is that you wish to engage with us, come talk about ethics, daylight, and architectural education, managing complexity in design.
It's like, oh, that's the first one. That's the first one. Yes, it is. Thank you. So I can, let's see, forward, backward. Yep. Okay, very good. You want to just test it quickly before you? Sure. Yep. Okay.
All right.
Well, before we got started a few minutes ago, Steve suggested that he asked what he thinks we might have in common, and I found it impossible to answer not having heard his presentation.
Yeah,
So for
unfair.
but you did use the word performance. You did use the word improvisation, and those things interest me. Although I will not address those things maybe so head on as you did. I'm Martin Schwartz. I teach at Lawrence Technological University, which is near Detroit. I'm an architect by training also, and my area of interest is in daylight in architecture. But I can reassure you that I'm not a research scientist. I don't count foot candles or foot Lamberts or lux or BTUs, although that can be very useful. My interest in daylighting is has more to do with how our understanding of daylight has always influenced architects who have made, I think, the best buildings in the world. That is to say, I don't know of any good architecture, or even much less great architecture, that does not address light, sunlight, daylight, skylight, shade, and shadow. And so I've been looking at this and thinking about speculating about how to put this across and some greater notions about this. One of the things that I find interesting was that in the reviewers' notes, people who reviewed my paper, my abstract for approval for the session, scared me a little bit because they said that my approach was novel. And it bothered me because one of the things I intend to do is to make the case against novelty. So I may be in a little bit of trouble here. This is a brief outline of what I'm going to talk about. I want to talk about, from the architectural point of view, how we manage complexity, or at least one approach to it. So we'll talk about complexity, and I'll talk about things that change, things that don't change. I will talk about and try to make the case that much of the time, the solution to complex problems is in fact contained within the problem itself. I will talk about some problems we may have with making objects as opposed to space, which is a subject of daylight. And then I will make some speculations about the ethics of the design of architecture with reference to daylight. So I want to show you some examples of complexity. This image, which is, can you see behind me? Oh, there are places to see all around us, aren't there? This is the Thorsager Church in Denmark from about the year 1200. And it may not look very complex to us at the beginning, but in fact, there's a lot going on here. There's, for example, a very small window opening, a small aperture, but with a very large embrasure, a very large surround. We can ask why that is, how those two things, what is the relationship between those things? We can talk about how this opening was made in a thick wall and how it spreads itself open. We can talk about how the vaulting was made, the pattern of bricks, and we can look at why there are these irregularities. Perhaps some of the bricks failed, they spalled off over many years and were plastered over and painted over. So there's a lot going on in just this image of how we receive this daylight in this building. Another example of some kind of complexity. This is a painting by Gerhard Richter. I think any of us quickly can see that this painting is a square. It's actually very large. Just to give you some idea what the scale is. Okay. It's a square, it's made of squares, but it's also made of these grouping of squares of 5 by 5, which you can't see unless, which is why I outlined it. Those white lines are mine. Pulled that square over here just to indicate this. What we don't know, in other words, there's a certain amount of order here, and it's pretty obvious. We're dealing with squares. What we don't know is what we don't have access to is this next level of complexity, which is to say how the architect or the painter might have or might not have decided which colors go where. And I have no idea, frankly, if there was a system, a pattern. So what's going on here is we have some layers of several layers of complexity. We have order and disorder. In fact, I would make the case that complexity is clearly not disordered, but it's a situation where we have competing orders that we are compelled to examine in some way to see if we can find patterns, something that has to do with our expectation and predictability. So this is a sculpture. You can see here, there seems to be an abstract order of curves and triangulation. If you look close, you can see actually it's a human head. There are at least 2 different orders going on there. And the human mind, as you know, has evolved to see patterns. We look for squares, we look for simple shapes, we try to, our minds will work with a certain amount of efficiency in terms of energy. We tend to look for concise patterns, things that we recognize, including human faces. So I want to talk about daylight as a possible model for managing complexity. So I'm going to talk about things that change, things that don't change, things that change in the face of things that cannot change or fairly stable. So we'll talk about 3 examples, first of all, complexity. I want to talk about the relationship of the sun and the earth, which I think most people studied in one way or another, which is to say that the earth revolves around the sun, it does so at a slight tilt, which accounts for day and night and seasons, which also then accounts for our sense of time, our sense of organization and order in our world. These are patterns that incorporate change, but which are incredibly predictable. Human beings have been able to predict these patterns for quite a long time. Then there are things that don't change or don't change very much, like architecture. That doesn't change at all, but we design things so they are fairly stable. Then there are things that change unpredictably. I have 2 examples. One is the weather, which then interrupts or improvises upon the cycles of the sun and the earth. Right? We know where the sun's going to be in the sky every day. And we can look it up, we can predict it, but we don't know exactly what the lighting conditions are going to be because there's weather, cloud, fog, smog, rain, snow. The other thing that's unpredictable is people. Who would have known that Einstein would have met Le Corbusier? That's a great photograph. It's this unexpected thing, and people do unexpected things. I tell my students that when they ask me how to set up a room plan, I like to point out that architects complete their buildings and go away and come back like 18 months later, and what do you know? Clients have moved the furniture. It's outrageous. So anyway, one of the things I've noticed, one of the things I've examined is that the solution is often clear with the problem, which is to say, if we have a question about lighting, a problem, we can let the sun do the work. The solution to the problem is contained within it. So, for example, we notice that places where there is strong sun, there's also strong shadow. And shade is the solution. Right? And in fact, even better than that, you have a choice. If you're in the mood to walk out in the sun, by all means, go ahead and do that. If you want the cool and the relief from glare, you can step into the shadow, to the shade. So if we're looking to make buildings that are rich, it's sometimes complex. My position is, and what I've learned from daylight, what I maintain, what daylight suggests to me, is that we don't have to make buildings that are very complex. Because the sun will do the work, because it changes all the time. For example, this is a swimming pool. This is designed by one of my students. And in the swimming pool, it's going to receive, we predict it's going to receive sunlight in the morning at about 9 o'clock, which would be very nice. After a cool night, be able to swim in the sun. At midday, and this is in March, by the way, at midday, we would minimize the heat of the sun because we have shaded it properly. And at the end of the day, again, we might get sun, or we might revise this design such that we minimize that late afternoon sun, which is not a bad idea. So the sun is doing the work. The sun is doing the work of making the building rich, complex, flexible. It gives us hints as to what people need to do. I'll give you another example of something that's actually built. These are the sun angles over the course of the year in Toronto. You'll notice that the sun is reasonably high in the sky most of the year. It's a little bit low in December, but it gets pretty high out of our cone of vision when we get to the spring and the summer. But it's not like this all over the entire world. When we get to the extreme latitude, north and south, say in Scandinavia, Copenhagen, the sun spends most of the time very low in the sky. And the problem there is that if you have windows, that sun's coming right at you. It can create heat and it can create glare. So if you have windows, openings in a vertical surface, you encounter a problem. It seems to be high here, but remember that's just at noon, and it's in the middle of the summer. The sun is spending a lot of time right there in our cone of vision. So if you're an architect and say you personally are sensitive to light, what do? Well, one thing you need to look at the fact that if the sun is there, that clear, even diffuse, wonderful skyline from the blue sky, from the overcast sky, is right up there, and it's wonderful light, and it's usable light. I've symbolized that, I've noted that by using these sort of 4 parallel bars and that arrow. That is to say, up at the top of the sky is the light that we sometimes ignore. For example, if you teach architecture or artists, talk to students, and they think either there's sun or there's no light, right? So here's a building. Is anyone familiar with this building? Some of you maybe. It's not a gotcha question, I think. This is the church just outside of Copenhagen, designed by George Wilson, whom you may know if you did the Sydney Opera House. But in fact, this is the only building he ever did which was done completely to his specification inside and out. Sydney Opera House is not. It's a wonderful place. Show just a few pictures of it. Go back. One thing I want you to know is there are no windows. There's some clear stories out there, but essentially there are very few or almost no windows in the exterior of the building. And yet the building the interior is infused with daylight, skylight. One of the ways in which he did this was to design corridors that are very tall and very narrow. They're painted white. They're all skylight. They're completely skylight. You can see one of the corridors here and another one of the corridors here. So what he's doing is, quite clearly, he's minimizing, not completely excluding, he's minimizing the amount of direct sunlight that comes into the building, into the corridor. He's using, when sunlight does come in, sometimes it reflects, and it's typically above your head height or on the side of the wall. So you can begin to see here, it's a little bit harder to manage the north-south corridor when the light comes in low, but that disappears in the middle of the day. And again, there's plenty of shaded area. This is the sanctuary. The light enters from a clear story, which is in fact an opening in a vertical surface, but far out of your point of vision. In fact, it's very difficult to see the clear story itself from below. You have to really angle yourself. So the light sources in here are concealed. From this area along this aisle, there are skylights again, but all that light that comes down is bounced off the architecture. It's diffused before it comes in. So again, This building, which I'll show you, is incredibly simple. The building itself does not have to change. It doesn't have to make a lot of funny shapes to be rich and to provide a good area for people to do what they need to do, which cannot be predicted. So there's a plan below, a section above, and I want to point out some things. This plan is incredibly simple. In fact, it's made of square. In fact, it's made of squares, and in fact, a much smaller level than I've shown here. But you can see the major groupings are squares within them, and rectangles. Where the magic is, where the variations are above our heads in another zone. The light blue zone there is this area of the architecture, which is above our heads. That's where the light comes. That's where the variations are. But in the ground plane, where people have to improvise, where they have to carry on their plays, as Stephen might have pointed out, where they perform, where we perform, it's very, very simple and very flexible and open to all kinds of variations. Evidence for the fact that Utzon did this intentionally is in part confirmed by this house he did for himself. At essentially the same time he designed the church. This house is in Mallorca. He did this for his family. And I don't have the Mallorca and Barcelona sun angles for you, but the sun is mostly high in the sky. It's up there. So what do? He's gathering light from horizontally, from the lower part of the sky and off the water, space of the Mediterranean. In fact, and there's only one opening which catches sunlight, really, on a regular basis, at the southwest side of the house. That is to say, he is now selecting, again, the part of the sky with minimum sun. When sun comes in here, and it does sometimes, it typically doesn't enter very far because of the angle of house. The orientation is such that when the sun comes in here, it only comes in completely very early in the morning on a winter day when the sun is really low in the morning, and then it moves out of the range of that. When high sun does come here, it typically bounces around, reflects and reflects in these beautiful days. So he's doing the same thing in another climate, in another latitude entirely. So what do we learn from daylight? Well, I think it's the richness and variety that we desire in our buildings. That was missing that was somewhat excluded in the modern movement. Can be found in daylight. If we want to see change, invite the sun to build it, it moves, it changes, it cannot be stopped from changing. But we have to be able to configure our buildings to be able to receive it. But when we do this, when we consider daylight, it allows us to make a range of really intelligent decisions about spaces and people. It's an instigator for design decision. This is why I leave the investigation of footpans and foot lamberts and thermal things to other people. Just as an architect, a person who sits down at a table and tries to figure out how to make a building, I think about building orientation. I think about what materials to select. I think about how to assemble these materials. I think about circulation, how people move through a building. Do they move in light? Do they move in darkness? I think about spatial order and organization and daylight. Thinking about daylight is an invaluable aid in making these kinds of decisions. So a couple of examples again. This school, this is not a very complicated building. But if you look again at the way light enters the building, you can see that the orientations are recognized, that one side is very different from the other. And so the building has a balance, but it has a kind of a motion to it, in part instigated by some knowledge about where light's going to come in and when. This is the Stockholm City Library. There was a decision made here about zoning. Zoning the activity area in which people do what they need to in the library, from how light is brought in. In this drum, this completely cylindrical space, there are windows, rather large windows. It's hard to tell because of the, it's hard to determine the scale from this photograph. But those windows surround that drum, which is to say, it recognizes the fact that in Scandinavia, high latitudes, you actually have sun all day long and all around the sky. And we can design for darkness as well. we can design shadow. This is a church by Cedar Leverance in southern Sweden. And the reminder, this is the important part, I think, that knowing this, what daylight, what the design of daylight and the design of shade and shadow should tell us, is that as architects, we don't design objects so much as we design space. What we design, what we need to design and pay attention to is what happens between the floor and the ceiling, and between that wall and that wall, and that window wall and this wall here. Because we're designing things for people. That is to say, most of what we do is not for us. We do things for other people. Buildings we design are for other people, and we need to think about their activities, which are sometimes unpredictable. So here's a room that's designed for daylight. Piazza San Marco, all piazzas, courtyards, large and small, are really about ways of gathering, of receiving and gathering daylight, the light of the sky, so that people can have that sense of protection, of order, as well as the unpredictable, predictable consequences of the light of the sky. And this is where that we should recognize, take it as a proposition. What we do is primarily for other people. It's not the same. We should never satisfy or please ourselves. We all have to find pleasure in our work. But if we think about daylight, we have to think about what people, the unpredictable element, what people do. This word vulnerability has come up in some reading about Charles Moore. He said bona fide vulnerability, as I see it, involves caring about the specific things you find and find out about so much that you will change your position to accommodate them. He also goes on to say additionally that he respects invulnerability. He says one isn't good or bad. He's not taking that position. He interestingly says that the architects we see as invulnerable, the great masters of modern architecture, also looked around the world and found things that were useful and interesting to them. But the way they used them is different. He says that the way they use them is actually to support a position they've already established for themselves, to prove something. His interest here is encountering things that maybe we didn't know before, or at least leaving space for them, leaving time for them, and maybe changing our point of view to be able to incorporate those things. And he refers to this as a kind of a vulnerability. So again, the solution, I think, is often contained in the problem. If we let the sun do the work, at least in terms of daylight and design, if we plan about change, and I want to make a case about novelty here. This is interesting. We often design objects that are space. We all like objects. We all like one, I love my coffee maker, right? I love my phone and all this stuff. It's impossible. I love this chair. But at a certain point, we have to think about what people do. And I think if we're looking for things like patterns in the world that are around us, patterns, predictable patterns, like the sun and the earth, those things that really are the basis of our life, we have to understand that it's worth paying attention to and finding a deeper understanding of things that already exist. So Charles Eames, amazing, a person who a lot of people would say was a great innovator, said innovate as a last resort. And I would maintain that that's carried out to a great extent in his chairs. I mean, the wood undercarriage, the bent plywood undercarriage is not incredibly, it's not so novel really. People have been bending plywood for eons, for thousands of years. It's the way he used a material that we have always known about. That's maybe more synthesis than innovation. Certainly it's not novelty. Or if you prefer a musical analogy, I refer to the great rhythm and blues singer Wilson Pickett, who said, you harmonize, then you customize. You understand the world, and then you act upon it in a way that, in concert with that. So I think that our role is, in fact, in terms of architecture as an ethical position, is to make space and to put surfaces in the path of daylight, be able to receive that energy and to let people and think about play upon spaces and to understand the flexibility. Thank you.
All right, thank you very much. I think our last speaker today is Archie, and she will be talking to Sai, and she'll be talking about creating an intersectional third space, contemporary art and model.
PowerPoint.
Yes.
Right there. And looking for the remote. There.
This for the next.
That one's next and that one's back. Okay. Let me get it. Here. Start. Is that correct?
Good morning. I am a student at Master of Arts in Art Education at School of Art Institute of Chicago. And this presentation, I try to summarize the research I carried out for my thesis titled Creating an Intersectional Third Space for Contemporary Art in India. And the research deliberates upon the disproportionate representation of self-taught and indigenous or tribal art within the mainstream contemporary art scene in India. So this presentation is divided into 4 parts. The first, introducing the premise of the research. The second, elaborating the methodology used to carry out the research. Third, discussing the field notes and findings. And fourth, concluding the findings. Coming from a small town in India, a territory that is a little rural to be called a city and a little urban to be called a village, my life, like several other citizens of this town, exemplified an in-betweenness. Situated away from the economical, political, and cultural centers of the country, the field of art as I know today did not exist for me. I remember using the terms art and craft together or interchangeably. I used it liberally for handlooms we wore and made, for sketches and drawings in our art books, and also for rangolis or floor murals made on festivals. It was common for schools to have a rangoli competition where a group of students decided and executed rangoli designs within the school premises. Art taught in school focused on scenery and geometrical designs in elementary and middle school before completely being taken off the syllabus in high school. In 2012, when I left my hometown to begin work at the inaugural edition of Kochi Muziris Binale, facilitating artists while they produce large-scale artwork, I saw how art worldwide had seamlessly accommodated new art practices and mediums, and I wondered why it still remained exclusive in treating art coming from self-taught and indigenous art practices. These distinctions felt further pronounced in geographies like India, where artists rely greatly on privately owned art galleries for their representation. The artists from rural or non-English speaking regions, artists practicing indigenous art, and skilled and passionate artists who do not have the resources or opportunities to attend art schools lost out on access to representation in the mainstream art spaces. In decolonizing methodologies, Linda Smith writes, decolonization does not mean and has not meant a total rejection of all Western knowledge. Rather, it is about centering our concerns and worldviews and then coming to know and understand theory and research from our own perspectives and for our own purposes. The question then was, Instead of refuting already formed institutional structures of art representation, how can we create a space that holds all notions of art justly? How can we represent them all without imposing the ideologies of the dominant structures on the art produced through non-formal pedagogies? How can we redesign our institutes from a collective perspective so that they serve our purposes? Post-colonial theorist Homi Bhabha, in his seminal work Location of Culture, addresses this conundrum by proposing an in-between space for the cultural encounter, which he calls the third space for cultural enunciation. This in-between space undermines the binary thought and does not merely produce a combination of two opposites. Interpreted by many cultural theorists as a process by which the hegemonic powers attempt to transform the identity of the marginalized people within a uniform global framework, the usage of the term third space in my thesis referred to the interstices between colliding cultures, a liminal space which gives rise to something different, something new and unrecognizable, a new area of negotiation, of meaning and representation. In this in-between space, new cultural identities are formed, reformed, and constantly in a state of becoming. In the exhibition Sheher Prakriti Devi, which translates to City, Nature, Goddess, that took place in Gallery Mir Chandani Steinruck, I saw my past notion of art, a notion that still persists in the vastly ignored non-urban India, alongside the contemporary art that is widely accepted and appreciated globally. Here, Gauri Gill, an artist formerly trained in art and photography, Vinny Gill, a self-taught painter with continued practice of over 60 years, both living and working in the Indian capital city of New Delhi, and Ladki Devi, a Warli artist who learned art practices as part of a familial heritage, living and practicing in the village of Ganjar, exhibited aspects of world making in their distinct approaches. The methodology I followed for this thesis can be mainly classified as a qualitative research. However, I decided to conduct the study following the instincts of my curiosity to gather information with authenticity. I approach it organically, and hence the methodology entails a form of emergent strategy. Emergent strategy, a term coined by Adrienne Mary Brown, refers to the strategy of building complex patterns and systems of change through relatively small interactions that are ever mutating and emergent. In the book, Brown reminds that change is consistent and evident, and recommends learning from feeling, mapping, and assessing it rather than fearing it. I molded the methodology into what Brown calls a living agenda, something that allowed me to create possibilities in the flux of constant change that are sometimes internal and at times external. With that, the research did not intend to conclude the exhibition as a success or a failure in curatorial or capital gains it generated, but hope to derive cultural or social significance of such collaborations for the exhibiting artist and consider ground realities in order to look for sustainable approaches for an equitable representation. The nature of questions posed to the artist was simple and did not involve any specific matrices for evaluation. They were conversational with an aim to better understand the artist, their thoughts, and their processes. However, after the interviews, to present my arguments better, I decided to divide the responses in the following indexes: the motivation or inspiration for art making in the three pedagogies, the self-perception about seeing their work in different contexts or setting, the adaptations they made in their art practices to participate in the exhibition, the effect of the exhibition on their practices, the nature of their relationship and trust between the artists, the future of their practice after the experience of the exhibition, and the significance of this exhibition for them. Though visualized as a personal Zoom or telephonic interviews, they were finally conducted according to the comfort of the interviewees. The interview with Gauri Gill, who is also the curator of the exhibition, was conducted over a 2-hour-long Zoom call. Having shown her work as an artist for nearly 20 years, the artist was used to talking about her work and thought process spontaneously. However, the other two artists, Winnie Gill and Ladki Devi, having spent most of their time making art for reasons other than representation and exhibition in cultural spaces, were not used to talking about their work unprepared. Hence, the interview with artists Winnie Gill and Ladki Devi was conducted as a questionnaire that I shared with them through Gauri Gill. While communicating with Winnie Gill was possible in English, the questions for Ladki Devi, who did not speak a common language with me, were prepared in Hindi, a language vastly spoken in northern and western regions of India. The questions were passed on to Gauri Gill to her son Rajesh Chaityavangar, who then transcribed the questions orally to Ladki Devi. While she responded to them orally, Vangar jotted them down in writing. The images of the responses were shared with Gauri Gill, who then shared it with me. I translated the responses to English, and Gauri Gill fact-checked and the translation. I felt it is imperative to note that the responses by Ladki Devi used in this research have passed through many hands and would be modified version of her original responses. In this section, I will talk about the artists, their backgrounds, and the part of their practices. So Gauri Gill began her career in photography through academics, education, and photojournalism, building a rich archive documenting the stories from the margin. Listening to their stories and bearing witness to their ongoing lives in the long forgotten and often neglected regions of the country, Gauri's record of their tales, beliefs, and spirit through her lenses led her to experiences and realizations that could hardly be represented or assimilated through journalism. Her first exhibition within the realm of contemporary art only took place at the age of 40, and today, in a period of a decade, she has managed to not only get the stories of the margin to a wider public, but she has collaborated and enabled the community she has worked with. Winnie Gill was educated at a convent school set up by the Christian missionaries in the scenic hill station of Dalhousie. There, she learned art as part of her school curriculum from the nuns. Once out of the school, she carried out her practice as a hobby. In 1965, at the age of 19, she got married and traveled extensively around India as her husband got posted for various government assignments. However, she continued to nurture her interest in art all along. She feels art making is a part of her life. It is part creative and part meditative. She says, just seeing the bark of a tree or observing a fluttering butterfly or the rising moon at the dusk inspires her. I feel art making without any particular deadlines, market, or necessity takes an immense amount of observation, self-discipline, and passion. Over the years, through experimentation, she has taught herself to paint in several mediums like oil, watercolor, pen, pencil, pastels, and mixed media. Varlis inhabit the Thane district of the Western Indian state of Maharashtra and are a predominantly agrarian community. They firmly believe that their world, the farms, ground, trees, mountains, wind, water, almost all the elements that surround them, are a form of worship. Their language, written without a script, relies greatly on this pictographic form of storytelling, and Suwasinis, or the married women of the tribe, are bestowed with the responsibility of carrying out this ritualistic form of storytelling, which is also known as Varli. During a marriage ceremony, two Suwasinis are invited to be present, and later They along with other people, men, children, and women from the village, make dev chalks or chalks on the wall of the houses. They make Kuldevta or Devi, that is ancestral male or female deity of the community, on the walls, which are then worshipped. Traditionally, for the Warlis, the role of Suvasini, the original bearers of this tradition and knowledge, has been extremely crucial in carrying out their lives. However, being culturally reluctant to go outside of the village to pursue work, since the 1970s, it has been the men of the tribe who have represented the art form outside of the communities. With men as storytellers, stories of the gods and goddesses, rituals, celebrations, and devotions turned into themes of train journeys or a day at workplace or farms. Ladki Devi learned to carry out these rituals by accompanying and observing her mother and other elderly women perform ceremonies while growing up, and she followed the same tradition to teach her children, two of whom are prolific Wali artists themselves, this form of storytelling. With this exhibition, Ladki Devi, taking back the agency of storytelling to the Suvasinis, decided to interpret the infinite forms of the Devis or goddesses who appear to engage in a wide range of everyday activities, usually performed by women, as well as the fundamental duties of various aspects of Mother Nature. I noted several inferences. However, in the interest of keeping time, I shall go through some of the most visible ones. While the love and passion for their practice motivates Winnie Gill and Ladki Devi, this experience has instilled immense confidence in them. Winnie Gill, who had to be persuaded to participate in this exhibition, is now aspiring for a solo exhibition. Ladki Devi, despite having to modify her practice to make her work portable for this exhibition, was proud that she is the first Suvasini to have represented this art form in a gallery, has paved way for several other women from her community. In fact, after this exhibition, her work was shown in Dubai along with 19 other contemporary artists from India. These outcomes in terms of emotions and future engagements were possible because this collaboration had stemmed from strong relationships built over decades. The respect and familiarity and trust for each other's self and practices made this exhibition a significant milestone for the participants. Finally, I'd like to conclude by saying, in recent times, there has been an influx of the exhibitions in the form of biennials and specially curated shows that exhibit juxtapositions of contemporary and tribal art. However, there are hardly any avenues where formally trained artists are represented equally as institutionally trained artists. At present, there is an urgent need to get voices from the margins and the margins of the margins to the center. Their integration into the already existing representational systems will ensure sustainable regeneration of their tradition and knowledge and legitimize their methods of creative expression. At the same time, this will enrich the landscape of Indian contemporary art with distinct viewpoints and become truly representative of the diverse demographic of the nation. However, they cannot be expected to fit into the present-day institutional structures of commercial representation. An immensely competitive space that merely hopes to exhibit, promote, and trade art could diminish the confidence that such collaborations are intended to harbor. The participation requires a relationship-centric approach built on trust, faith, and humility based on attentive and intentional listening that is difficult to come out of conventional artist-curator or artist-gallery relationships. This needs negotiation of space and knowledge building, a third space that not only represents and exhibits, but finds ways for the intersectionalities of class, culture, gender, and region to interact with the intersectionalities of generation and pedagogy. An intersectional third space, a concept that builds new structures for knowledge making and sharing, along with the motive to hand the authority to tell the stories back to them. Thank you.